My name is Neka Sunlin. I am the program manager of Resource Central Slow the Flow program. I've been with the organization for 9 years. And I oversee the program that does sprinkler evaluations in many places here across the Front Range. So we're thrilled to have you with us tonight. I'm co-hosting with my colleague Lisa Anderson. So I'll let her hop in here and introduce herself right quick.
All right, hello everybody. My name is Lisa Anderson and I am the Slow the Flow program coordinator. I've been with Resource Central for about 3 years now and I'm very excited to talk to you about some sprinklers today.
Great, thank you, Lisa. All right, so I'm just going to give you a brief overview of why we're here and what we hope that you all will get out of this presentation tonight. So we really are hoping that people will just get a better understanding about your sprinkler systems in general. So we're going to talk about the capabilities and honestly the limitations of sprinkler systems. So in order to accomplish that, we're going to discuss efficiency, performance, and talk about some simple changes that you can potentially make to improve your sprinkler system. And the reason we want to do that is so that you can make more informed decisions about your sprinkler system and specifically how you water with it. Now, Phoebe did mention that this is the second webinar in our Smart Irrigation series. So Lisa and I already presented one 4 weeks ago on March 6th, getting to know your sprinkler system, which was really geared towards people who were kind of beginners to sprinklers. And so we talked a lot about the terminology. So this is a next step up from that. So we do assume that you have a basic knowledge of sprinkler systems in general and some of the terms and components. If you didn't see our first webinar, you can see that it was recorded and is on our YouTube channel. And then again, we have another one coming up on May 8th about perennial garden irrigation. And ultimately, the goal is to save water. So especially in the summer times, we use over half our water on our landscapes, and a lot of that we're putting onto our lawns via our sprinkler systems. So again, we're hoping that by improving some things, we can really help folks save some water. All right. So first, I'm going to start off talking about efficient watering and why it matters. Then Lisa's going to take over for a little bit and talk about some DIY maintenance. She's really going to talk a lot about heads and nozzles and things you can do to improve their performance. Then we will take a quick question and answer break. When we come back, Lisa will continue and teach us how to convert a regular sprinkler zone to drip and things to consider before doing so. And then I will wrap it up with talking about some smart technology. Specifically, I'm going to address smart controllers and rain sensors. All right, so this term efficient watering or sprinkler system efficiency is something some of you may have heard. Probably don't understand what it is. So we're going to talk about that. So for the most part, when we say, I want my sprinkler system to work better, what we mean is we want it to be more efficient. So in a nutshell, what efficiency means is getting the right amount of water in the right places with as little water wasted as possible. So the way we do that is by watering evenly. So we don't want underwatered areas and overwatered areas. We want to water as evenly as possible. It gives us a nicer, more uniform look to the lawn, certainly, and it's just healthier and it saves water. The other way we do that is by watering in a manner that will maximize the absorption by the soil. So it doesn't matter how much water we're throwing on our yard. If it's not getting absorbed into the soil, it's not doing any good. So we want to make sure we're maximizing that so we're not getting a lot of puddling or runoff. That really does help conserve water and then hopefully save you some money too. So now let's talk about what affects efficient watering. So the first thing is the design of your sprinkler system. So this is the actual physical components. So when we're talking about design, we're talking about the layout. How many heads are there? Where are the heads? Things like that. It is honestly the most challenging and the most expensive part to change. So we're not going to focus on that this evening. It is just something that we like to mention, that the design of the system does, very much impact the performance of your system. The next thing that affects things is the condition of your system. So this is basically the state of repair it's in. So your sprinkler system needs maintenance. It needs some love every now and then. So that's going to be, are things broken? It's also going to have a lot to do with adjustments. Are things adjusted the way that they should be? So a lot of that stuff is actually fairly easy to do yourself, and Lisa's going to talk about some of that in a little bit. So this is easy to challenging to address. A lot of times it's free if you're just making adjustments. If you do need to replace some components, it's generally not too expensive, but does cost a little bit of money. So your design and your condition work together to make the performance of your physical sprinkler system. So those are going to affect how evenly and how quickly the system is applying water to your lawn. The other thing that affects your efficient watering then is your watering schedule. So that's how long you're watering, how frequently, that type of thing. And luckily that is easy and free to change, because that is literally just reprogramming things on your control clock. And that's important because that directly affects how much water the soil is absorbing. We don't want to overwhelm our soil. So we want to water on a schedule that will allow as much water as possible to soak in. So now I'm just going to introduce you to some efficiency and performance terms. So if you get a sprinkler evaluation from us, or if you have ever looked stuff up online, you might have heard these terms. So I just want to talk briefly about what they are. So distribution uniformity, or DU, is the standard term for describing the efficiency of a sprinkler system. It is literally considered that. So really what it's doing is just telling us how evenly the system is applying water, and that is measured in a percentage. So for comparison, rain is 100% distribution uniformity, effectively. So think about your yard. When it rains, every part of your yard gets the same amount of water. So your sprinkler system ideally is doing the same thing. Well, sprinkler systems aren't perfect, and so they can't achieve 100% uniformity, but we try to get them as close as we can. Generally speaking, 70% is considered good. So we're looking at 70%, and a good way to think about that is the parts of the yard that are getting the least amount of water, it's getting about 70% as much of the parts of the yard that are getting the most amount of water. It's a little more complicated than that, but generally speaking, that's what it means. So again, 70% and above is considered good. And then precipitation rate. While PR is not specifically a measure of efficiency, it can help you determine how long to run your individual sprinkler zones. So that is a measurement of how quickly your system is applying water, and that's measured in inches per hour. There are a number of things that affect your PR, but the first and foremost, it is highly dependent, on your head and nozzle type of the zone. So generally speaking, spray heads water 1 inch to 1.5 inches an hour, rotor heads 0.5 inch to 1 inch per hour, and rotary nozzles little less than 1/4 inch to about 0.4 inches per hour. So it makes a big difference. And then again, the people like me who come and do testing on your yard, we would use that in order to come up with a watering schedule for you, because that PR affects the run times. So the higher the PR, the lower the run times. So if you're putting a lot of water out at once, you don't have to water very long. Conversely, if you have a low PR, you're going to need to water for a longer period of time to get the right amount of water down. Now, a lot of people have a tendency to think that a high PR is better. It's actually not. So it's not as much of a grade, so to speak, as distribution uniformity is. It's just a number that we use to determine how long to run. But for the most part, it's better to have a lower PR, because again, we don't want to water so fast that we're overwhelming the soil. But we do have some scheduling techniques to take care of that. All right. So now let's talk about what an efficient system looks like. So I mentioned design and condition are the two things that affect the system performance. So for design, ideally what you have is you have the right type of heads, the right number of heads per zone, and you want them in the right places in order to water as efficiently as possible. And then for your condition, you don't want anything to be broken. So no broken lines, heads, or nozzles. And you want to have appropriate nozzles on each head and have the heads and nozzles properly adjusted. Another thing that we see a lot is this, as the clay soil compacts and just over time, heads will have a tendency to sink or tilt. And so as that happens more and more over time, that significantly can affect where the heads are spraying. So ideally you want to have a minimal amount of tilted and sunken heads. And really this is where that regular maintenance comes into play. So your sprinkler system is like your car. It's intended to be maintained and have certain things, performed on it every once in a while. All right, so now let's talk about an efficient schedule. So we definitely want to have the appropriate number of days per week for each zone. So you definitely want to adjust those throughout the watering season. When you first fire up your sprinklers, say, mid to end of May, you're not going to be watering as many days as you are at the end of July. So these days, a lot of our local water providers and cities have watering restrictions. Some cities restrict you to specific days of the week, things like that. So please make sure you're checking with your local water provider to see if you have any restrictions, and please make sure to adhere to those because some of them will fine you if you don't stick to those. So, but pretty much across the board, no more than 3 days per week for any of your turf. Okay. Now, I mentioned this a little bit ago about how we can adjust our watering to compensate for the soil absorption. So the way we really handle that here is with cycle and soak. So clay soil is really good at holding on to water, but it doesn't absorb a whole lot at one time. It saturates quickly. So if you just water and water and water, it gets saturated, and any more water you put on top of it does not soak in, and it'll puddle. And if you have any type of slope, it will literally run off, which is why it's called runoff. So even though you're putting that water out, you are getting no benefit from it whatsoever, and it's literally running down the street. So the way we do that is instead of running for one long cycle, we want to break it up into 3 shorter cycles. Another thing you want to do to really dial in your efficiency is customize your watering time per zone based on the precipitation rate and the zone conditions. So is it sunny? Is it shady? Things like that. And then the other thing you can do is make sure you have zones that are different hydrozones on different programs. So as a refresher, a hydrozone is just an area of a specific watering need. So your turf grass is one hydrozone, your perennial shrubs are another hydrozone, your vegetable garden is another hydrozone. So all of those have different watering needs, probably need to be watered a different number of days per week. So the way we can accommodate that is by putting those on different programs on our control clock. So I'll give you an example. So here I have 6 zones on 3 different programs. And just so you know, most modern clocks have the ability to run at least 2 programs. Huge majority of them can do at least 3, some can do 4 or more. So here in my example, I've got my 4 turf zones on program A. Excuse me. I'm watering them 2 days a week, 3 cycles early in the morning, and you can see my run times. Now, both zones 1 and 2, I have as spray zones. One is sunny, one is shady, so I have tweaked my number of minutes for those. Same thing with my 2 rotor zones on zones 3 and 4. Then I have my perennials on program B. In my example, these are established shrubs. I'm only watering them 1 day a week on Wednesdays. This is my zone 5, and I'm running it for 45 minutes at 6:15 again on Wednesday. And then I have a vegetable garden that I water every day at 6 in the morning for 15 minutes. And again, the reason I do this is obviously it's a different number of days per week. You can see I have cycle and soak on my turf because I have a very high precipitation rate, and therefore I need to just do it in short bursts. My perennials and veggies are on a drip line that has a much lower application rate. You don't even need to do cycle and soak on those. So you can just do one longer cycle on those. And then don't forget that it's really okay to experiment with your run times. So even if you have a professional come out and measure your PR or give you some advice, it's just a starting point. Trial and error is honestly the best way to dial in your watering. So if you have a current schedule set up and your plants and grass look great, you can always dial back your run times a little bit and see how they react. If they're still fine, then you're good and you've just saved some water. And if they're not fine, you can always bump it back up. But that's really the best way to determine that. All right, so that is efficiency. So now I'm going to turn the reins over to Lisa, and she is actually going to talk about some heads and nozzles and how you can actually improve some of that efficiency.
Give me a second here to get my PowerPoint up, everyone. Okay. Okay, there we go. All right. So we're going to talk a little bit about some DIY maintenance, and specifically, we are going to go over different types of heads and nozzles, letting you know when you might need to replace a head or a nozzle, and a little bit of a how-to to replace heads and nozzles. And the reason we're going to focus on this is just because changing out nozzles especially is very cheap and easy, and pretty much anyone can do it. And it can make a big impact in terms of reducing your water waste and creating a more even watering pattern in your yard. So first, we'll just review the difference between heads and nozzles. We did talk about this a little bit in our last webinar, but this is just for a refresher. So a sprinkler head is the entire body here. There are rotor heads and spray heads. Rotor heads rotate and spray heads are stationary. That's how you know the difference. So when these are in the ground, most of this is underground. When the system is off, this top part here is flush with the ground. When your system comes on, the water pressure pushes up on a spring that's on the inside. This stem pops up, and then this nozzle here is where the water actually comes out of the head. So again, this whole thing is the head. The nozzle is this part incorporated into it where the water actually comes out. And then on a spray head, it's similar. Again, the stem will pop up, but the nozzle here is just this top portion. So for spray heads, there can be two different nozzle types. There is a spray nozzle, which is stationary. The water comes out in a fan-like pattern. And then there's a rotary nozzle. So the head itself is stationary, but a rotary nozzle, the nozzle itself will spin, and it has more little jets of water coming out rather than a fan pattern. All right, and nozzles in most cases for rotors and sprays are removable and interchangeable. There are a few types of heads where the nozzle is actually incorporated into the head itself, but in, I'd say, probably 95% of cases, the nozzle is going to be removable. All right, so let's talk about sprinkler heads a little bit more. So in an ideal situation, you're going to have the same make and model of a head type throughout each irrigation zone in your yard. That's not always the case. I know at my house was built in the 70s, and it's kind of a Frankenstein system. So I have all different brands and types of heads as they've just replaced them over the years. But in a perfect world, it's all the same brand, make, and model throughout a zone. So if you want to make a zone more uniform, or if you just need to replace a head that's broken, there's two things that you need to be aware of. There is an appropriate height and an appropriate radius that you need to be looking at. So a standard pop-up height is 4 inches. And what I mean by the pop-up height is basically this stem, this part that literally pops up out of the ground. So in most homes, again, it's going to be 4 inches. There's rare occasions where you might have a 6-inch head or a 12-inch. That would probably be if you have a steep slope in your yard. The heads at the bottom of the slope might need to be a little taller. Or if you have native grass that you keep longer, and you might need taller heads. But again, the vast majority of the time, you're going to be looking for a height that's 4 inches. And it will say that on a rotor head or spray head when you're purchasing them. So one thing you want to aim for in terms of the radius is to get head-to-head coverage. And what we mean by that is that water from one sprinkler head needs to reach all the way over to the adjacent sprinkler head. So you can see in this little diagram here, this head on the left, the water reaches all the way over to the center head, and then the center head reaches all the way over to this head on the right. So the radius that we're aiming for is this distance between heads. Here is an example of where you don't have good head-to-head coverage. In this case, the water's only shooting about 60% of the way to the next head over. And the reason we want this head-to-head coverage is it just provides a lot of overlap and makes watering more even. As Neka was talking about that distribution uniformity, and we're trying to be as even as possible. When you have two arches overlapping, you're just getting a more even coverage. In this setup here, you're probably going to have a lot of spottiness with dry patches in your yard. In some cases, if you don't have perfect head-to-head coverage, you might be able to actually adjust the head. We did talk about this in our first webinar about adjustments you can make to rotors and spray heads with just some basic tools. And you might be able to change the nozzle out also to improve the radius. But in some cases, that's just not going to be enough. So every head has a maximum radius that it can reach. And so if the spacing between your heads exceeds that maximum radius, then you're probably going to have to replace the actual head. So for example, say you have rotor heads that are 15 feet apart, but the maximum radius on them is only 10 feet. Then you're going to need to get a different head that can actually accommodate that 15-foot radius. And then just one other thing to note is there are a lot of other specs for different products. We don't really have time to cover all of those in today's webinar, but there's some heads that have pressure regulation, some that have check valves, which basically prevent water from leaking out of the head after the zone is turned off. There's some heads that have stainless steel versus plastic, so they're a little bit more durable. There's some heads that are better for non-potable or hard water. So there's a lot of different features that you can look at. My suggestion is to look at the product guide for different brands and see what you might need for your specific yard. In the handout that we have for this webinar that you'll get tomorrow, we do have links to a few different popular brands and their product guides so that you can review those differences between heads that they have. All right, so now that we've talked about heads, we're going to talk about nozzles. And specifically, first, we'll talk about rotor nozzles. So the nozzles on a rotor determine the flow rate and the trajectory angle of the water spray. So I'll go over those in detail here. So when you're replacing the nozzle on a head, say your nozzle's broken or you just want a new type of nozzle, again, you're looking at flow rate and trajectory angle. The trajectory angle is basically the angle at which the water is coming out. So you can have a low or standard angle. The low angle is going to be pretty flat. The water is going to come out pretty much parallel to the ground. So you're going to want that if you have a small space, like a front yard, where the heads are close together and it just needs to kind of water along the grass. If you have a large area, like a backyard, or a very big area, like a football field, then you're going to want a standard angle, which is more of an arch, like a rainbow. Usually on the actual nozzle, you can see if it says LA, that means low angle. And then here you have some examples of the flow rate, which can also be called the precipitation rate. In these photos, there's numbers on these nozzles. So in this blue one, it says 4, and that is gallons per minute. And on this red one, it is 2.0. It might be a little difficult to see, but that again is 2 gallons per minute. The colors of these nozzles, just so that you're aware, are pretty much just brand specific. So this red one is a Hunter PGJ. Any nozzle that you have for this one is going to be red. So it's just an easy way to know, like if you need a replacement, you're kind of looking for this color. All right. And then the next thing you want to know is, well, what kind of flow rate do I need? So within an irrigation zone, you're probably going to have rotors of different arcs. So you might have a quarter circle, and you might have a half circle, you might have a full circle. This full circle would be heads that are just in the middle of the grass. This half one is heads that are along a fence or along like your driveway. And then this is for a corner head. So because rotors rotate, they cover different amounts of area of grass. So they need different flow rates. So this quarter circle, if you had it going at 1 gallon per minute, this full circle head needs to be 4 times higher in flow rate because it's covering 4 times the area. So this way, again, you're just creating a more even watering pattern so that each area of your grass gets about the same amount of water, so you don't have some parts that are dry and some parts that are soggy. All right, So next, let's talk about spray and rotary, also called high efficiency nozzles. We talked about this in the last webinar a little bit, the difference between them. But just so you're aware, a spray body can accommodate either a high efficiency nozzle like this one or a spray nozzle like this one. They are the same size. So these nozzles, they are a little bit different. They determine both the radius and the arc or spray pattern on the head. So the radius is just the distance that the water sprays out from the head. This is indicated by color on these types of nozzles. So you can see in this example here, this has the number 10. That means it can shoot up to 10 feet. This one here has the number 12. That means it can shoot up to 12 feet. They're usually adjustable by about up to 2 feet or about 20%. And just so you're aware, the number is the maximum on these. So this brown one can shoot between 10 and 12 feet. And then the arc is the shape of the water spray. So most heads spray in a kind of a circular pattern. And there's these fixed amounts. So there's a quarter, which is 90 degrees, half at 180, 3/4, which is 270 degrees, and then a full circle, which is 360. Excuse me. So again, there's fixed nozzles, and then there's also adjustable nozzles. The way you can kind of visually tell the difference is with fixed nozzles, they're kind of smooth on this collar portion, whereas adjustable have these little ridges. And these specific nozzles that I have here pictured are Rainbird, but other brands have very similar patterns. It might not be ridged on the collar, it might be more around the rim, but it'll have ridges if it's adjustable. So I mentioned with the rotor nozzles that you want to have different flow rates for different types of heads. One nice thing about spray nozzles is they usually have that already incorporated. They match their precipitation rates automatically for these fixed versions. So you can have a zone that has some 90-degree nozzles, some that have 180, some that are 360, and they all put out water at the same rate, which is what you want for spray heads. So that's a little bit easier. You don't have to worry about your different flow rates. But I will say for adjustable nozzles, the flow rate can change on these based on how wide of an arc you do. So if you do, say, a 10-degree arc, it's going to have a higher flow rate than if you do like a 300-degree arc. So that's just something to be aware of. And you would want to do an adjustable nozzle basically just if there's a section of your yard that is a funky shape that's maybe like 120 degrees or something where it's just not a perfect square. Depending on your zone, you might need different radii. So nozzles with different radii if it's, again, not a perfect square, but it's okay to mix and match. All right, and then a few other things about spray and rotary nozzles. There are some specialty arc shapes. So side strips is the big one. A side strip is that narrow portion of grass that is between the road and the sidewalk. It's maybe 3 to 4 feet wide and very long. So for these, you don't want it to water in a circular pattern. Instead, it waters really long one way and then really short another way. And you can see there's a variety of different types, like in terms of how wide they are and all that, but they all essentially do the same thing. So just be aware of this. This is something we often see during our evaluations, is people put regular nozzles on a side strip, and then it's watering the heck out of the sidewalk, and you don't want that because you're wasting a lot of water. So make sure you use these specialty nozzles in these kind of areas. Next, there are some specialty nozzles. There is one called the U series, and this is from Rainbird, that has a dual spray, basically 2 openings where water comes out from the nozzle. So the top portion here sprays far away, and the bottom portion here sprays close by. So this is really good if, say, the design of your system isn't great and you don't have that good head-to-head coverage. Again, because it waters close and far away, it just is a little bit more even than other types of nozzles. So it's really good, again, if you have poor head-to-head coverage, and also on slopes, just because slopes can be a really tricky landscape to water. And then lastly, just a note about brand compatibility. So there are female threaded nozzles and male threaded nozzles. Kind of the standard or norm is the female threaded. I'll show you some pictures here. So Rainbird, Hunter, and Orbit all have this. So they are interchangeable. And so if you have like a Hunter spray body, you can put a Rainbird nozzle on it and it will work just fine. As I talked about before, it's generally best if you have the same brand throughout a zone. But again, you can have hunter heads with rainbird nozzles or rainbird heads with hunter nozzles, whatever you like. The only one that's not compatible is Toro. As you can see, it's male threaded, so it has this little portion that comes down here. So if you have Toro heads, you have to use Toro nozzles. So just something to be aware of. All right, so when would you maybe need to replace a nozzle or a head? So some of these might be obvious, but we'll go ahead and just go over them to cover our bases. So the first is if the nozzle is visibly damaged or broken. Of course, you're going to need to replace it. Another case is if the nozzle has blown off. So this can happen if it's not very secure on the head. When the water first turns on, it has really high pressure. It can just literally shoot it across the yard. Next is a rotary nozzle. If sometimes they stop spinning after time, and then they're not very efficient with their watering. So if you have a rotary nozzle that isn't moving anymore, you probably need to replace it. And then lastly, if your head just doesn't have the right nozzle type. So as a reminder for rotors, that means if it doesn't have the right flow rate or angle. And for sprays, if it doesn't have the right arc or radius, you'll want to replace it with one that does. And for heads, again, if it's visibly damaged or broken, you'll need to replace it. If there is water leaking out from any area besides the nozzle, so from the stem, from the base, from anywhere else, that's wrong and it probably needs to be replaced. For rotor heads, if they stop spinning, most likely you should replace. Sometimes those gears just get clogged up over time or wear out. You know, regular wear and tear makes the gears stop moving, so you need to get a new one. Similar to a nozzle, sometimes the head can actually blow off of the fitting. That's not as common. It might be like if you hit it with a mower or something, you know, it really knocks it out of place. This is very obvious because you'll see a little geyser of water when this happens. And then the last thing is if the head has an incorrect radius that's beyond what you can adjust for. As I talked about, you can adjust a little bit, but if it's beyond that maximum radius, you might need to get a new head. And then just a note as far as cost on these, nozzles tend to run about like $3 to $7 a piece. So they're not super expensive. I think if you buy in bulk, generally they're a lower cost per nozzle. And then heads are somewhere usually between $10 and $20 each, just to give you an idea of what to expect if you're replacing things. And then my last note here is, so if something's broken, you're going to want to fix that right away or as soon as possible. Whereas I sort of talked about before, like maybe your zone doesn't just have the best coverage, it's a little bit spotty. That's not quite an urgent issue. But if you're looking to kind of make some upgrades to your system, I would do one whole zone at a time. And here's just some photos for you to give you some ideas of broken nozzles versus broken heads. So these are broken nozzles here. Clearly this blue one has been chipped probably by like a weed whacker or something. So this one will need to be replaced. This one in the top right is when a nozzle blows off. You can see it creates basically a jet of water that goes straight up. A lot of people might look at this and think that it's a broken head, when really the head is fine, it's just the nozzle. And since the nozzle is so much easier and cheaper to replace, make sure that you're just replacing the nozzle, not the whole head. And then this bottom picture, this sprinkler is spraying all over the sidewalk. It's a 180-degree arc, and we need it to be a 90-degree. So we would just swap that one out so that we're not wasting that water. And then next, here's some just examples of broken heads, just what they might look like. In this one, there's a seam in this rotor, and there's a bunch of water spraying out the back. Here, it's kind of squirting out the base, and then here is where there's actually no head, and there's just a little bit of that geyser action going on that I talked about. All right, so now we'll just do a quick tutorial on how to replace a nozzle. So the first thing you'll want to do is turn your irrigation zone on. Then you're going to use some type of tool to clamp the head that you're going to be working on. For rotors, there's something called a hold-up tool. You can use a channel lock if you have that. We use Rainbird reverse pliers. And the reason, again, you want to hold it up, as I talked about before, there's a spring in here. So as soon as the water turns off, this usually just snaps back down. So while you're working on it, you want to have a way to hold it up so that you don't have to hold it with your hand because that's really cumbersome. So get something like this. So for spray heads, again, the nozzle is just the top portion. You're just going to unscrew it. It's righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Pops right up. So make sure you do have a filter. You can use the old filter or the new one, whatever you prefer. Just make sure you have a filter in there. You're going to get your nozzle and screw it back on. So very easy. Then the last thing you need to do is just make sure it's pointing in the right direction. We talked about this a little bit more in our first webinar, but essentially you grab this stem and you can move it back and forth so that it's pointing the right way. And then for a rotor, so the nozzle is kind of more embedded in the head here, and it might be hard to see. Yeah, you probably can't see that too well, but there's a little set screw here that's holding it in place. So I'm going to take a small screwdriver and go in through the top. Excuse me. And I'm just unscrewing that screw. You don't have to unscrew it all the way, just enough so that it's not blocking the nozzle anymore. Pop that nozzle out. Whatever new nozzle you have, pop that back in. Go back in the top here and screw it back down. And voila, you are done. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't actually show that there. So in both cases, what I would do is you're going to want to turn the water back on after you replace the nozzle, just to make sure you don't need to make any final adjustments with the radius or the arc or anything. Make sure it's pointing the right way, all of that. And I might not have mentioned this, but when you're changing the nozzle, the water is off. Otherwise, you are getting soaked from head to toe. So. And that's just here a picture of that clip that holds the rotor up. All right. So that concludes our DIY maintenance section. So we're going to take about a 10-minute question break. So any questions that you have for Neka or I on these first two sections, we are happy to answer for you.
Yeah. All right, Lisa, we do have a couple of questions that are really good ones, so I wanted to hold them for our break here. So I'll actually take the first one because it had more to do with my section. So we had someone write in, when you determine your run times, how deeply are you intending to water the soil? Fantastic question, Maureen. So we're shooting for a 1/2 inch of water per watering day. Now keep in mind, we're typically divvying that up over our 3 cycles, but your total for the watering day, we're generally shooting for a 1/2 inch of water. So great question there. And then we have a question, Lisa, if you want, I'll let you handle this one from Alessandra. Is there a way to measure approximately the drip rate of my drip system?
Sure. So it's going to be different for each plant because you have different emitters for each section that might put out different rates. Those are measured in gallons per hour, whereas sprinklers are gallons per minute. But usually the emitter will be a certain rate of like a 1/2 gallon per hour. So it's not necessarily the whole drip system, but like per individual plant. And that really just depends on what your setup looks like.
Yeah. And I'll just further that. So when you're going to install it, just like Lisa did a great job of showing us on those rotor nozzles, how you can very clearly see which one's rated to 4 gallons per minute, 2 gallons per minute. Drip emitters come the same way, but again, rated in gallons per hour. So if this is a drip system that you did not install and is already there, that can be a little trickier to figure out what it is. But honestly, what you could do is you could put some type of bucket or something under individual emitters and then run the system for a certain amount of time and try to figure it out that way. But unfortunately with drip, it's not as easy to do a test like that as it is for your sprinkler zones. And again, you likely have emitters of very different rates all along your drip line, which is both a good thing because you can really customize your watering for each plant, but also if you don't know what your rate is, it can be a little challenging. And then we do have another question, which is a great one. So Mimi, we're going to actually leave this question asking about You got rid of turf, your old system design doesn't match the current flower beds. Any recommendations on how to transition? Lisa is literally going to talk about that in the next section. So we're just going to leave that for that section. Let's see what we have else coming in here.
Yeah, I can answer the one from Carol here, Nika.
Okay, go
She
for it.
asked if there's any tips for non-potable systems or sprinklers. So I mentioned that there's some heads with different specs, and they're, at least with Hunter, I know there's specific heads for non-potable water. So they don't clog as easily because that water tends to be a little harder. You can also, not that you have to change your heads out, but impact sprinklers, impact rotors are a little bit better than gear driven. They don't clog as much. So that's mainly your concern with non-potable systems, is it's a greater potential to clog. So yeah, typically those rotors that support non-potable systems have a light purple cap on them, just so you're aware of, like, if you like a visual.
Hey, Nika and Lisa, I just wanted to direct your attention. There's two questions that are actually in the chat versus the Q&A. I just want to let you know about those too.
Great, thank you. And just moving forward, folks, if you don't mind putting those questions in the Q&A versus the chat, that would help us to not miss them. All right. So I see a question, can you block one head in a zone? So generally speaking, in sprinkler terms, when we say a blocked head, that's not a good thing. I suspect you're asking about actually capping a head in a zone. And if that's the case, Lisa is literally going to talk about that in the next section. And we are not going to talk about drip tape or Netafim. So we're going to talk about drip conversion in this webinar.
Mhm.
And it looks like I'm going to do another one here. It says, I've been replacing my sprinkler heads nozzles. I'm finding leaky 1-inch black poly pipe that feeds the heads, often within a few inches of the joint. Is this freezing damage from the previous winter? So what I suspect this is about is actually that swing joint, which attaches the sprinkler head to the lateral line in the ground. And if that is damaged, yes, that is likely due from freezing from the previous year, or it could have been hit with a shovel or something like that. And if that is leaking, that will need to be replaced. And then let's see.
There's a good one here, I think, Nika, from
Okay.
Roy. It says, can I replace a spray nozzle with a rotary nozzle, or do I need to replace the entire head? So that is a great question. Yeah, rotary nozzles and spray nozzles fit on the same spray body, so it will fit. However, as Nika talked about, their precipitation rates are very, very different. So when you have a zone, you want the whole zone to either be spray nozzles or rotary nozzles. Otherwise, if you just are replacing one of them, then that head is going to put out much less water than all the other heads around it. But yes, in terms of the size and functionality, you absolutely can put a rotary nozzle and a spray nozzle on the same type of spray body.
Yeah. And I just want to emphasize what Lisa just said. If you change one to a rotary nozzle in that zone, you need to do all of them. Because if you remember from one of my efficiency slides, typically those spray heads with spray nozzles have a precipitation rate of 1 to 1.5 inches per hour, whereas those rotary nozzles are about a quarter to less than an inch per hour. You will give yourself very uneven watering. It is one of the absolute worst things you can do to your sprinklers is to only replace one of those. We see that a lot. That's why I'm stressing it. But very good question. All right. Someone asked that you hear correctly that Resource Center will come out to assess and consult. Yes, we do. So we do provide sprinkler evaluations. We work with about 40 different water providers and municipalities along the Front Range. Please go to our website to see if you actually are eligible for that, whether your water provider is partnering with us. I will say what we do, we will not go into as much detail on assessing what Lisa just did of reading your nozzles to see what their flow rate is. What we will do, however, is do catch cup tests to determine your distribution uniformity and your precipitation rate, and then we'll give you a customized watering schedule based on that to really dial in your run times. All right. And then Lisa, here's one about drip. It's not something you're specifically going to cover. So maybe we want to go ahead and answer this. Going back to the drip emitters on a hose that you might install in a veggie garden, how far apart do you position hoses relative to distance between drippers? So I think we're just talking about spacing.
Yeah, and I mean, so I would say it depends. It's kind of a specific question, but it depends on how far apart your plants are. Are they in rows? Are they kind of zigzaggy? Most inline drippers will have it'll be like a 6-inch interval or 9-inch or 12-inch. So they have different sizes basically for how many, the space between the holes. So I can't really answer more specifically than that without just knowing like your specific setup at your home. Yeah, anything to add to that, Nika?
Yeah, just again, like Lisa said, it really depends. So I've seen some and had some vegetable gardens where I have things very much in a row. The vegetables are very evenly spaced. So you might want to use more like an inline drip system for that, where it has regularly spaced emitters every 6 inches or 12 inches. You can also use micro sprays to water vegetable gardens. You might use individual drip emitters. So it really just depends. So again, Lisa's right. Unless without seeing the specifics of the system, it's really hard to say exactly what to do there. Somebody did ask about our consultations, asking about the cost. So the water providers that we partner with are the ones who fund our consultations. So it is free to you if you qualify. So, all right, let me see if there's some more, and then we will move on to the next section, excuse me. Oh, here's a good one. Larry, it sounds like you signed up for our Colorado Sprinkler Guide. So when you get an email telling you how often to water, number of days per week, is it specific to your location? So it is not specific to Longmont versus Boulder. It is generally the Front Range. But honestly, for the most part, everywhere along here in the heat of the summer, you're going to be doing 3 days a week. If you're doing that and you feel like it's excessive, you can always experiment yourself and just do 2 days a week. That's certainly your prerogative. There's not a right or wrong there. But yeah, we're kind of addressing the entire Front Range because that's where we work. Great.
Okay. Yeah, I think we need to just timing wise move
Yep.
on.
I think we
And
better
question
move
break
on.
at the
I
end.
can try to answer some of these in the chat. Or yeah. Just
Okay, so let me get my presentation up and shared again. Mhm. Okay. So again, we're talking about drip irrigation next, and specifically how to convert a regular sprinkler zone to drip. We wanted to talk about this just because it's becoming a lot more popular to take out some of your turf and convert it, because it helps you save water. It helps kind of add some diversity to your landscape. It's pollinator friendly, all of that. And not everyone knows how to convert a zone. So we're going to briefly talk about that today. So first, why use drip irrigation instead of your regular sprinklers? So for non-turf areas, so any kind of shrubs or flowers, anything like that, it's much more efficient to use drip versus sprinklers. And, estimates vary, but generally online, I saw about 50 to 60% less water is used with drip compared to just your standard sprinklers. So there's different types of drip, but most of them, like inline drip or emitters or soaker hoses, they deliver water right at the root zone. So this is great because it helps minimize water waste, runoff, and evaporation. It also can reduce the growth of weeds because you're only watering at the plant, not the spaces in between the plants. And also some flowers don't really like overhead watering. They can get mildewy or other diseases, so this helps limit that as well. So how do you choose an area of your yard to convert? There's a lot of different considerations. And for most people, I think the top consideration is probably aesthetics. So what looks pretty where? And that is important, but there's other things to consider, like the sun exposure of that area, the bordering plants and trees around it, and then the sprinkler system layout. We find that not a lot of people consider this when they're making a change, which is why we wanted to talk about it today. So when you're planning for an area to convert in your yard, the best option in terms of just your sprinkler system is to do three things. You're going to want to zone or convert an entire irrigation zone, and that zone should be self-contained, meaning it doesn't overlap with any other irrigation zones. And it should be a zone with non-functional turf. So non-functional turf is something that basically you don't use. You water it and you mow it, and that's it. You just look at it, it's aesthetic. Whereas functional turf might be something in a backyard where your kids or your pets, whatever, play on it. So in this next handout or slide here, I have a little infographic for you to just give you an example of what might be a good zone to convert. So as you can see, this is an aerial view of a home. Here we have the driveway and garage. Here's a patio. Here's the front yard. These circles represent sprinkler heads, and the colors represent different zones. So in this example, we have 7 different zones, and we'll start with kind of good areas to convert. So the best area that meets all 3 of those criteria I just talked about is this pink zone over here on the left-hand side. This is a side strip. So again, that's the area between like a road and a sidewalk. You don't use that grass at all. You can't play on it. You can't do anything with it. It's self-contained. This is all the pink head. So this is all one zone. It doesn't overlap with anything else. And you can convert the entire thing. So that might be a great option if you're considering a zone to convert. But let's look at some other areas too. So up here, kind of on the north side of the house, we have this yellow zone and this dark blue zone. So this yellow zone is something called a split zone, and that's because it's on 2 sides of the driveway here. You also sometimes have a split zone that's partly in the front yard and partly in the backyard. So this is fine to convert. It's just important to realize that it is on both sides of the driveway. So you can't just take out this chunk of grass. You have to do both sides. And if you did that, basically you would take out the grass up to these dark blue heads, and you would switch these out from a 180-degree nozzle to a 90-degree nozzle so that they're only watering this way on the grass that you have left. So kind of conversely, you could swap that. If you want to take out this blue zone, you could do that. And then just again, you're taking the grass out to here and you're switching these from 180-degree nozzles to 90-degree nozzles. So let's move down here to this area. So we've got 2 zones. We've got kind of this lilac color and these gray heads. So this isn't the most ideal zone to convert because it's not self-contained. There's a lot of overlap between the 2 different colors. And you also have a tree here. So that's not a bad thing, but currently the tree is getting watered by the sprinklers. So if you are taking the grass out and you don't have regular sprinklers anymore, you kind of have to have a backup plan for how you're going to water this tree. And then lastly, we have the backyard. And this is 2 different zones of these light blue heads and these red heads. This is a big open space and it's probably functional turf. Most people use their backyard, whether it's like for cookouts or again, if you have kids that like to run around, dogs that like to run around, whatever. So you might want to keep this grass because you actually use it. Also, there's complete overlap between the red zone and the blue zone. So these blue heads water all the way over to the other side. These red heads water all the way over to this side. So if you were converting this, you probably have to convert this entire portion of the yard, which might not be ideal. So again, sprinkler system is only one consideration for an area you might want to convert, but this just kind of gives you some ideas of how to take the sprinkler system into consideration for areas to pick. So there might be some other kind of non-conventional ways that you might want to convert a zone. Center islands are pretty popular, and then also just creating a border around the edge of your yard. And we'll talk about some things to consider if you want to make these choices. So if you're converting an area that's only part of an irrigation zone or occupies multiple irrigation zones, there's a few different things that you might do with the heads, the sprinkler heads that you currently have. First thing is you don't do anything. That's obviously the easiest option, but you won't be saving any water. You're using the exact same amount you were before, and then your new plants are going to be watered quite a bit. It's probably overwatered, and then they might die or just not really look very good. So that's maybe not the best option. Next thing you can do is you can cap heads, which essentially is a way to get them to not water anymore. You can also move the heads. This is the most labor intensive and it requires a lot of digging and plumbing work in your yard. And the last thing you can do is you can convert the heads that are now in these new xeriscaped areas. So when you're capping heads or moving them, it really can affect that head-to-head coverage. Of course, you know, you're moving a head 4 feet away. Now it's not going to have the same overlap, and you're going to have maybe some patchy areas, again, areas that are very dry, areas that are very soggy. So that can be a potential issue. Capping heads is the same thing. If you have a sprinkler that's no longer watering a certain area, then the area surrounding it might be dry. If you're converting a head in a zone, then you are going to have both turf and xeriscape plants on the same irrigation zone. Now you can do that, but there are issues. As Neka talked about with scheduling, usually you want your xeriscape areas to be on a separate program or a separate watering schedule as your turf, because they have very different watering needs. So if they're on the same zone, then you have to water them on the same days and for the same length of time. So it's very hard to dial that in and make sure that you're not really overwatering or underwatering one of those plants. So that can be an issue. A way around this, you know, if you're capping heads, moving heads, all of that, you can hand water. And by hand watering, I mean water with the hose, the areas that get a little dry or aren't fully covered. And then in some cases, you honestly might just need to hire a sprinkler installation expert if you're making big design changes, which of course can be a lot more costly and time consuming, a little bit more than a DIY. So just some things to be aware of. Again, these aren't wrong to do a center island or a border. We just like you to be aware that if you're moving heads, it's going to affect your coverage and you're going to have to make some tweaks to the arc and radius potentially of certain heads. It's going to require a little bit more work. All right, but now we're going to talk about one method of DIY drip conversion. So there's a lot of different types of DIY conversion. We're going to focus on one specifically, which is the Rainbird Spray to Drip 1800 retrofit kit, which is quite a mouthful. We're talking about this method because it's just pretty cost effective, very accessible. Most people are able to do this. And also in this scenario, we're kind of assuming that you're choosing an ideal zone to convert. So one that's an entire zone, it's self-contained, all of that. So in this method, you're basically doing two things. You're taking one head from your irrigation zone and you're converting it from a regular sprinkler head to this modified head for drip. And say you have 6 heads in this zone. So you're doing that, converting one head, the other 5 you are capping so that they're no longer spraying any water. And I'll go over how to do both of these things. So the items in this kit are pictured here to the right. So it's a pretty, I'll say, bare bones kit. You just have this head and T-fitting or an elbow fitting. So most likely you're going to need to purchase some other items if you get this kit, like caps, tubing, drip emitters, and a manifold if desired. So just be aware that it's not really an all-inclusive kit. Okay, so you can see this looks pretty much like a regular sprinkler head, but there are some differences, and this is important to note that it has a pressure regulator so that you know, your drip system needs to be at a correct pressure so that you don't have your emitters or spaghetti tubes flying off. And it also has a large filter because the tubing is very small and you don't want it to get clogged with any dirt or other debris. So we're going to talk about how to convert the one head that you're converting in the zone. And there's 2 different things. So if you already have Rainbird 1800 spray heads, it's a little bit easier. So I will talk about that first, but you can convert pretty much any type of head. So if you already have a Rainbird 1800, you can remove the internal assembly, which is just a fancy way of saying the guts inside. So what I do, you just can unscrew the top and take the guts out. So now I just kind of have an empty shell here. And from your new kit, you're going to remove those guts and then put them in, screw back on. So you don't have to dig this up or anything. You might need to push the dirt out a little bit just so you have access, but it's pretty easy. Just unscrew, screw it back in, you're ready to go. If you have any other head type, it takes a little bit more elbow grease, but still isn't too hard. Essentially, you are digging around the sprinkler head, setting that dirt to the side, you are unscrewing the whole head. Here, this just screws onto a fitting. So you're unscrewing it, taking it off, taking the retrofit kit, screwing it on, packing the dirt back in around it. And then this T-fitting or elbow fitting goes up here on the top, and you can attach your main line drip to it, and it goes out to the plants. So yeah, there's a few different ways you can set up your drip, but this is just kind of a common way. Again, here's your T-fitting. So you have main line coming off of it. You're going to have these little spaghetti lines that go to each individual plant, and there'll be a specific emitter attached to each of these spaghetti lines. You can also do a manifold like this picture here. That is if you have a very small area with plants that are very close by. And in this case, the spaghetti tubes just connect kind of directly to here. All right. So as I mentioned, you're converting the one head and then you're capping any other heads that you have in the zone because you don't want them to be spraying water anymore. There are 3 different methods that you can use to cap heads, and I'll briefly go over each of them here. So the first is a temporary fix. This is going to be where you screw a blank nozzle on to a spray head. So it looks very similar. I've lost my nozzles here. To this kind of nozzle. It just doesn't have an opening for water to come out. So it's just essentially a little cap that you screw on. Something to note with this is when you turn that zone on, those heads are still going to pop up because they still have water pressure to them. So they'll spring up. They won't spray out any water, but they might leak a little bit just because these heads aren't going to contain all the water. So that's a more temporary fix. The next is a semi-permanent fix, which is screwing on a sprinkler cap to the actual head casing. So as I noted before, you can kind of remove this internal component, and then there's a cap that you just screw on, and this is empty. It just stays in the ground. So it's not going to pop up when you turn the zone on because there's really nothing in here to pop it up. You will still see where the head is just because the cap will be flush with the ground. So you'll see where that cap is. And one important thing to note is that the caps are brand specific. They are not interchangeable. So if you have a hunter head, you need to get a hunter cap. If you have a rainbird head, you need a rainbird cap. And the last method is the more permanent method, which is screwing on a PVC cap on the actual riser. So in this method, you are digging up that head, unscrewing it from the riser, and then placing this white cap on there, putting the dirt back over it, and you're done. So one thing to note about this is unless you make a map or a note of where that head used to be, you're not going to be able to actually see it. So in case you ever, for whatever reason, wanted to put a head back on there at some point, just make a note ahead of time. Like I said, make a map or put a flag or something to show you where that head used to be. And the other thing to note about this is if you're converting a zone that has rotor heads, this is the only method that will work because rotors, you can't put this nozzle on a rotor or this cap on a rotor. So this is the only method you can use if you're converting one of those zones. Okay, and then the last thing I'll touch on here is just drip line maintenance. So the first thing you want to do after you've converted your zone is you need to adjust your watering schedule. As we talked about before, you're going to want to probably put it on a program B or C so it's not on the same schedule as your turf. And it's going to be probably a very different runtime. So my recommendation is to refer to drip guides. There's one from Rainbird that we have linked in our handout that tells you kind of the type of drip to select and the general runtimes for different types of plants. We also recommend to inspect your system regularly, so about once a month. I would go out and look to make sure you don't have any leaks, cuts, or tears in your tubing. You can see in the photo on the right here just some examples of that. Make sure that your tubing or emitters don't pop off. You can see in this photo, there's a little spaghetti line here, and it's popped off of this main line. There's this little jet stream coming out. And also you might have some misaligned or misplaced emitters, So say you have a tube that's kind of moved over to the side and it's no longer watering your plant. You're just going to want to place it back so that it's watering what it's supposed to water. Excuse me. The last thing is you'll want to clean the filter on that head probably about once a month as well. the filter is going to get clogged up. So unscrew the top of the head, take that filter out, rinse it in a bucket or under a faucet, and just clear it of all the debris. Right, and that is it for this drip section here. So Nika's next going to talk about some smart technology, and then again, we'll leave some questions at the end.
Yes. All right, so let me take the controls once again here. All right. Does my screen look okay, Lisa?
Yes, it does.
All right, fantastic. All right, so I'm going to bring us home, folks. Thanks for hanging in with us so far. So now we're going to wrap it up with talking about some ways you can add on or upgrade your system a little bit in regards to your smart controller or a rain sensor. So first, let's talk about what are smart controllers. So it is just a different type of control clock. I have a couple examples here on the screen along with a phone, which I'll explain why in a minute. So this is something that you would actually replace your existing control clock with. Now, what makes them smart is that they talk to local weather stations to get weather information, and then they will create and adjust the watering schedule for you. And then the reason you see the phones and the pictures with them is that they are controlled with an app on your smart device. Most people run them from their phones. Here are a couple of examples. We've got a Ratio up here on the top and an Orbit Beehive down here. There are many other makes and models. This is just an example of a couple of them. So let's talk about some of the benefits of smart controllers. So as I mentioned, they use weather data to create your schedule, and they're highly customizable. So you can put a lot of strict restrictions on them and basically treat them like a regular clock and put them on what's known as a fixed schedule. And excuse me, and have them water, very specific days and times like you already do, or you can let it do its own thing where it again uses that weather data and completely creates a schedule on its own, or you can go somewhere in between. So you have a lot of flexibility. You can really customize your scheduling. If you have already been overwatering and you replace your existing clock with this, it can actually reduce your water use because then it will just be doing what you need. So it could potentially save you some water, again, if you've been overwatering. It will do all of that guesswork for you as far as, again, adjusting to the weather. So if it rains a lot, it might skip some waterings. If it rains a little bit, it'll still water, but it will water less. So you don't have to worry about making those adjustments yourself. And as long as you have internet, you can control and monitor your sprinklers on your phone anywhere in the world, which is kind of neat. So if you're on vacation, you can still be keeping an eye on what your sprinklers are doing. And honestly, it's just really cool to be able to walk around your yard and turn your sprinklers on and off with your phone. So things to know and keep in mind if you're considering a smart controller is they do need reliable Wi-Fi. And they need that Wi-Fi wherever they're going to be located. So typically when you install these, you're putting them in the exact same location as your existing control clock. So you need to make sure that your Wi-Fi works well at that location. For most folks, it's in your garage, your Wi-Fi is fine, but I have actually seen some places where the Wi-Fi doesn't work well at that location. So people have to get a booster or just a smart controller is not going to work for them. So make sure you're comfortable using apps on your phone. Some people are not. So this is not for everybody. A lot of people are fine with that. Depending on the brand that you get, you will need to download their proprietary app and use that to run the smart controller. One thing to be aware of is the weather data they're using is from local weather stations. Local means near to you, obviously not across the state or another part of the country, but it still could be, a few miles from your house. So sometimes the weather might not be exactly the same. So it might be raining at your house and not raining at the weather station, and the smart controller will think it's not raining because it's not raining at the weather station. So as I mentioned, if you're overwatering, this can save you water. Conversely, if you're underwatering and you install one of these, it can actually increase your water use because again, it will be doing what it feels is appropriate. Now you can put restrictions on it, So it won't do that, but it is something to be aware of, especially if you've been underwatering. And we talked about at the beginning in my efficiency section about the design and condition of your system are what make up the performance. So if your sprinklers have a very poor design or in disrepair, installing a smart controller is not really going to improve anything because it just affects your schedule. And so again, if your sprinklers are in disrepair, you really need to address that before getting the smart controller. All right, so let's talk about another option. So rain sensors. So I got a couple examples here. Up here on the top, this is a Rainbird rain sensor. Down here is a Hunter. There are many, many other brands and models. So those do not replace your existing clock. They actually connect to your existing clock. What they'll do is detect rain on your property and stop the sprinklers from watering. Excuse me. Now, most sensors these days have two parts. They're wireless. They have a sensor part that goes outside and actually detects the weather. And then they have what I personally call a brain interface that will go usually in your garage or basement, wherever your control clock is, and actually connect to your control clock. Here in the orange here on this Hunter, this is the brain that would be wired to your control clock. Here's the Rainbird brain, again, would be wired into your control clock, and then the sensors are in blue. You can see they look quite a bit different, but they do the same thing. So that would be installed in your yard outside, and would actually be subject to the rain. All right, benefits about them. Again, they detect rain and will stop from raining and will potentially skip some upcoming watering events depending on how much it does rain. So most of them have like a quick shut off. So if they detect rain at all, if you are watering while the rain starts, they will actually stop the sprinklers from watering. And then you can actually, on most of these, adjust a threshold to to skip the next watering event. So for example, you can set some of them to say 1/4 of an inch. So if it rains 1/4 of an inch or more, it will skip the next watering event. So a lot of them have that and that is adjustable. Oops, excuse me. So these do work with most modern control clocks. There are some older clocks like electromechanicals that aren't really able to accept these, but the huge majority of control clocks are able to accept some kind of rain sensor. And then one huge advantage of these is that the detective rainfall is specific to your property, wherever you hang that sensor. And so they are actually incapable of increasing your water use. They can only decrease it. So if it rains, they're going to shut the sprinklers off and potentially skip a next watering. And you won't be one of those people who waters while it's raining. So that's a nice benefit. All right, so things to keep in mind that even though most clocks will accept a rain sensor, not all models work well together. So some models of rain sensor don't go with some models of control clocks. So if you are considering a rain sensor, make sure you know what make and model of clock you have. And then whenever you're looking for that rain sensor, just make sure it is compatible with your current clock. Remember that these do not adjust your watering times, whereas a smart controller will. This rain sensors are binary. They're on off. They'll either let your sprinklers do their thing, or again, if they detect rain, they'll shut them off. You do need a good spot for the sensor. So you want to make sure it's getting all of the rain that's falling on your property. So you don't want to put it under a bunch of trees. You don't want to put it over an overhang on your house. I've actually seen that. You're basically making it ineffective. A lot of times we'll put them on fences just because it's easier to access, but kind of out of the way. You can also put them on gutters or up near your roof line. You just want to make sure they're getting the full rain that's falling on your property. Now, in regards to that placement, you do want to make sure that you're putting them in a spot where the sprinklers will not hit them. I have seen some set just a few feet off the ground and the sprinklers actually hit them when they run. Your rain sensor doesn't know the difference between rainwater and the water from your sprinklers, so you just want to make sure it gets the rain, but not the sprinkler water. They do require a little bit of attention, but once you have them installed, it's very infrequent. So those wireless ones, the sensor will run off of a battery. They generally last 2 or 3 years. So it's not something you're doing very frequently, but it is something to be aware of. I've actually seen people be concerned that their rain sensor wasn't working, and it wasn't, and it was simply because the battery was dead. And then you don't have to bring them in during the winter. I personally recommend that if it's in an accessible area. If it's, 20 feet high on your roof line, I wouldn't worry about it. But if it's on a fence or somewhere where you can easily access it, I do suggest bringing them in during the winter. It'll just make them last longer. All right, so I've had some people ask me, should I get a smart controller or a rain sensor? There's not a right or wrong, and incidentally, you can get both. But let's look at a very quick breakdown here. Okay, so as a reminder, the smart controller would replace your current clock, whereas a rain sensor is going to connect to your current clock. With the smart controller, you're going to have to interact with it a lot. So you're going to set it up in the app, but generally you're going to be looking at that to see what it's doing. You can set them up to send you notifications when it waters or things like that. So you are going to be interacting with that quite a bit. Excuse me. Whereas the rain sensor, once you get it set up, you're not doing a whole lot with it. So it's going to be much more infrequently that you're dealing with it. And then as far as cost goes, it really varies. You can sometimes get them on sale or things like that. Generally speaking, you can find some control clocks, some smart controllers for, $100 or a little bit more, up to a few $100s. Whereas a rain sensor, it's a much smaller range, generally from like $80 to $100. Some water providers actually provide rebates for getting a smart controller or a rain sensor. So definitely check with your water provider to see if that's something that they offer. Now, something that I didn't address yet, but I'll just mention here, in regards to installing these, they're very comparable in the level of skill and time it takes to install them. So if you're even remotely handy, you can do this yourself, but if you're not comfortable with that, you can always hire a professional. So as a reminder, the smart controller uses weather from local weather stations, whereas the rain sensor is the weather at your property. The smart controller will adjust your watering schedule, whereas the rain sensor is an on-off only. And if you don't put any guardrails on it and you were previously underwatering, the smart controller could potentially increase your water use. Again, it's easy to correct for that, but it's just something I like people to be aware of. Whereas a rain sensor cannot increase your water use. It can only potentially decrease your water use. But if this sounds a little overwhelming, don't worry, because neither of these are mandatory. They're just a nice convenience and can potentially save you some water, but they don't do anything that you can't do yourself with some time and effort. But they certainly will make life a little easier in some ways. All right, well, that is all of our stuff. So we just want to conclude with a few key takeaways. So just as a reminder, what we are shooting for is efficient watering, which is a combination of good performance, which is your design and your maintenance, and then coming up with a good watering schedule that allows for maximum water absorption for the soil, which for our turf zones is certainly going to incorporate cycle and soak. Please make sure you are regularly maintaining your system and you have the proper equipment. So we had some questions earlier about what does that mean? Regular maintenance is do a visual inspection once a month during irrigation season and see if anything needs to be adjusted. Sometimes just running the lawnmower over some heads may not break them, but they might come a little bit out of alignment. So it's just always good to make sure your adjustments are really dialed in. And also, a lot of this stuff is plastic and it breaks on occasion. You never know when it's going to break. So when something does break, you want to replace it in a timely manner. That can make a huge difference in the long run on how well your system performs. And then if you are considering converting a zone to drip, please make sure you're planning ahead. As Lisa did a great job of describing, that planning phase is arguably the most important part of your drip conversion. So it's not that you can't convert whatever area you want. We just want you to know, we just want you to have the information to make an informed decision and have a plan for how you're most efficiently going to water that converted area and the areas around it. And then if you think you might want to, try out a smart controller or a rain sensor, just look at those different options and see what works best for you. All right, so that concludes our presentation. So we can absolutely do some more questions now.
All right, so we have a few good ones here, and I know we're kind of running over time, so sorry about that, folks, but we do want to, honor your questions that you asked, so we're happy to hang out. So one good question we had from the drip conversion section was, is it an issue with capping heads with winterization? And excellent question. So it kind of depends on which head that you're using for conversion. If it's the head on the end of the line, it shouldn't be a problem just because all that water is going to flow through that end head. If you're concerned about it, what you could always do, again, this is a little bit maybe more than a DIY thing, but you could actually cap off the pipe downstream of the head that you convert so that no water even goes into the rest of those lateral lines, if that's a concern. Neka, do you know any more about that, or is that your general understanding as well?
That's my general understanding too. What I would say also is if the head you're capping is vertically lower, the lowest head in the zone. So if your yard or the zone is on a slope and the head you're capping is at the bottom, all that water rushes down to that one. And if that's the head you're capping, then the water might have a tendency more to collect in there. And when the system is blown out, if the air pressure, isn't enough to blow that out, it could potentially be an issue. If you're capping a head that is actually upstream of that, of higher up, I would not think that would be an issue.
Mhm.
Yep, good question.
A great question, because absolutely everyone out here should be winterizing their system. We also had some questions about, can you convert more than one head on a drip line? Because I had mentioned, you're converting one and capping the rest. So I'll admit I had some trouble finding some definitive research on this when I was looking into this topic. I don't necessarily see a reason why you couldn't, say, do two heads, especially if you do have that split zone, like the example I showed where it's on two sides of the driveway. It doesn't really make sense to run a drip line across your driveway. So I would do one head on each side. Someone asked, could you do each and every head? And I think maybe the only downside to that is then you would just be managing, say, 7 different drip lines versus 1 or 2. So just maybe a little bit more cumbersome. But I think as long as you had adequate pressure and all of that, again, I couldn't find anything definitive, but I believe that would be okay. It just would be more work.
I agree with Lisa. We typically haven't seen that, and we don't have a lot of direct experience with it. But I agree with Lisa. I think if it's on either side of the driveway, which we see, grass in that situation a lot, I can't see it being an issue to do 2 heads. Converting all the heads in the zone is just redundant. It's just ridiculous. You might have pressure issues that way, but also you're just creating extra work for yourself. There's no reason, because you can run quite a long drip line off of one converted head. So there's really no point in doing that. Good questions.
Okay. I'll do just kind of all the drip ones first, and then I'll ping to you for the smart controller questions. So this one is, are you able to change heads to different zones without doing any digging or plumbing? So a zone is a bunch of heads that are all connected through the same lateral lines, so the pipe's underground. So unfortunately, you can't really change a head to another zone without digging, because you have to pipe it to the other heads in the other zone. So unfortunately, no. You can split a zone. So if you have those examples, maybe you have a zone where you only want to convert part of it to xeriscape and keep some turf. If you have space within your valve box and on your controller, you can get a professional to split the zone potentially. But again, that's a lot of piping, a lot of electrical work, kind of a lot of money. So that's not an option for everyone necessarily. Okay. I think that's kind of all the drip questions that I wanted to answer. So we have one here, Neka, that I'm actually not sure about.
Okay.
A question from Jeff that's, will the smart controller interface with my local weather station in my yard?
It should be able to. The ones that I have personally messed with, they have a variety of weather stations that they can interface with. So as long as that weather station is sending out like a signal via the internet, it should be able to interface with it. Yes. Sorry, we have scrolling through these.
Yep. And here's a good one I think that most people would want to know is,
Yep.
will a smart controller differentiate between turf and non-turf or drip zones that have different watering regimens if the rain sensor says skip a watering?
Okay, so I'm going to split that up into two parts.
Mhm.
Because that is assuming you have a rain sensor hooked up to a smart controller. So first I'm just going to take the smart controller part of that. So if you just have a smart controller, whenever you are first installing that, you're going to go through a setup process in the app, and most of the apps are really good at walking you through this. It's basically going to ask you questions about each sprinkler zone, and one of the things it asks you is what is your head type and what is your vegetation. So then you will be telling the Ratio or Beehive or whatever smart controller it is, you will be telling them zone 1 is a spray sprinkler zone with cool season grass. And zone 2 is a drip zone with perennial shrubs. So you are telling it that when you set it up. And then when it's just running your schedule, it then will customize the schedule for each zone based on what you told it. Now, the rain sensor, regardless of whether or not it's set up to a smart controller or a regular control clock, again, it's on or off. So when you install that rain sensor, you're going to set your threshold for the rain at your property. And if you hit that threshold or during a rain event, it's not going to water. But as far as skipping upcoming events, if it hits that threshold, it will tell the control clock, again, smart controller or not to water at all if you hit that threshold. So that's kind of 2-in-1, but it's a great question. Because that's a real world example too, because you can absolutely, and I personally think everybody should have a rain sensor. And so even if you have a smart controller, just because it is that hyper accurate data to your property. Great.
Okay.
All right. Do we have any more?
We have one more that's more about drip, but I think
Okay.
either you or I can answer. It's, what's the best way to check 20-year-old drip systems that are under landscape fabric? So in general with this, if you can't physically see it, one thing that we look at during our inspections is to actually listen. So see if you or listen for any like hissing noises, anything that sounds like gushing water, anything like that. You can also maybe see some just signs on the surface of pooling water. If the plant looks like it's almost like sagging, that might be where you have a break. If you want to make sure that the plant's actually getting water, honestly, after the zone runs, you could just use your finger, put it in the soil, see if it's wet, or put a screwdriver in there and see if that goes in. That kind of indicates the soil is wet as well. Any other tips that you would have there, Neka?
That's everything I was going to say.
Okay. Great.
And I'll just reiterate, generally, if a drip system has at least a significant break or leak in it, you will hear it
Mhm.
before you will see it. You will hear the gushing water. But otherwise, as Lisa said, you're just looking for the signs that it is working properly, which is that your plants all look good. And when you do the finger soil test, you can feel, okay, clearly it got water. Yeah. Great question.
So I think we're all caught up on questions. So thank you all so much.